Okay, so today I'm going to make good on the promise to take you from roughly the period following the Mongol invasions all the way up to the dawn of the 20th century. And this, roughly speaking, is the Ottoman era in Middle Eastern history, named after the dynasty that was started in Turkey by Turkish Muslims who eventually came to displace the Arab empires of the Middle East that had until then predominated. So, quick recap, we saw that there was a Hellenic, a Roman, and a Christian era in the Middle East. We then saw that the Muslim era could be divided into the Rashidun, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, and the Seljuks. Uh, the Fatimids were also part of this story, as well as the Nizari assassins, whom we have not talked about. These are Ismailis. And we also briefly touched upon the Crusades. Today we're going to talk about the Ottoman Empire and the beginnings of modern European influence into the Middle East. So, certainly after the Crusades, there were divergent trajectories, east and west. Islam certainly turned inwards towards more Puritanism. The worry was, I guess, that the Crusades and to a lesser extent the Mongol invasions thrust the Islamic world into a bit of a crisis of faith for a period of between 300 and 500 years. Islam was pretty much expanding. Arab armies were rarely, if ever, defeated, or if they were, these defeats were only temporary and tactical. So there was a lot of confidence. And when the Crusades came in and Mongols came in, that confidence started to ebb away. And people started looking for answers. Why is it that we're failing now? And of course, because religion and politics had never been strictly separated. Remember that Muhammad was both a religious leader as well as a military leader and a political ruler. What that meant was the political failure was interpreted as religious failure. So why was it that why was it that we had lost these wars? Muslims reasoned it must have been because we were getting a little bit too comfortable with our success. We were making too much peace with the material world. We were getting a little bit too interested in pleasure, a little bit too interested in wealth, and not quite as strict in our adherence to the tenets of Islam. And so it's during this context that the Ottomans slowly rose to power. Also, we have to look at the empires, the Arab empires that were ruling the Arab world at this time, or the ruling, yes, the Middle East at this time. These empires had some problems. First of all, they didn't have any checks and balances on autocratic rule like Western kingdoms. This meant that they were particularly vulnerable to succession struggles. What this meant was that when a ruler died, or even before he died, there was a lot of infighting over the succession, and this created a lot of instability. Uh, Mostly because rule was essentially what we call personalistic. That means that based on personal and family ties, and what that meant was that if you cut off the head, pretty much the entire, well, not the entire edifice, but the edifice was thrown into turmoil. And what this meant was there was a fair amount of insecurity, particularly for anyone who happened to own some land or be part of the elite. Talking about the Ottoman Empire a little bit, the Ottoman Empire, it's unclear exactly when it started, but 1299 to 1922 are the typical dates that you'll find, and some important dates in the history of the Ottoman Empire include when they finally defeated the Byzantine Empire with the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Constantinople became Istanbul as a result. The formal recognition as the Caliphate in 1517, this was when the Ottomans were formally recognized as leaders of the Muslim world. So the Ottoman sultans were recognized as caliphs, so both political, so reuniting both the political and the um, political and religious power were united into one position. It's worth noting that the Ottomans' armies laid siege to Vienna, Austria, twice in 1529 and in 1683, both unsuccessfully, but had the Austro-Hungarian Empire been defeated, it's very easy to see the Ottomans having spread it well into Central and even into Western Europe as a result. So these sieges, these failed sieges, were seen as really crucial to the history of modern Europe as well as the history of the Middle East. One thing worth noting, in the latter siege in 1683, the bakers in Vienna were fully anticipating the Ottoman armies actually succeeding and entering the city. And having seen the crescents, the Turkish crescents on the banners of the approaching armies, they decided to hedge their bets and start baking crescent-shaped pastries to welcome the invaders and hopefully not, be killed in the process. And so this is where we get these delicious pastries called croissants that eventually made their way from Viennese bakeries to Parisian bakeries in France and now kind of all over the world. But the origins of this the croissant is in the siege of Vienna by the Ottoman Turks. Trivia aside, one of the important parts of the Ottoman Empire, one of the things that made the Ottoman Empire work were its bureaucrats and its elite military troops, the Janissaries. The Janissaries were a very important part of the empire right up until 1826 when they were finally purged after an attempted coup on their part on the Sultan. The Ottoman Empire tried very hard in the 19th century to reform itself, to modernize itself, to keep up with European rivals. And part of these reforms include something called the Tanzimat reforms in 1839, which was consisted in some very progressive, even by European standards, very progressive reforms, an attempt to really transform the empire and bring it in, kicking and screaming into the modern age. But these reforms essentially were either not fully implemented or simply failed, and so the empire slowly declined until its eventual demise in 1922 with the Treaty of Lausanne after World War I, where the Ottoman Empire was on the losing side, having allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire was eventually dismantled and now is the country of Turkey. If we want to look at the empire at its peak, right, when it's knocking on the doors of Vienna, we can see that most of southern and eastern Europe was under the control of the Ottoman Empire, including large parts of Bulgaria, all of Romania, Serbia, Croatia, Greece, Macedonia, Slovenia, and parts of Russia and Ukraine, as you can see, are all part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire occupied much of North Africa, and as well as the Nile Delta and the Hijaz region, which is the region of the western coast of Saudi Arabia that contains both Mecca and Medina. And of course, as caliphs, the Ottomans were seen as protectors of Mecca and Medina. They also ruled Mesopotamia and a little bit of Iran and Azerbaijan as well. So we're talking about very large empire. The Ottomans, unlike the Arabs and more like the Greeks and the Romans, tended to not be interested in Turkifying their empire. The elites were Turks, the governors were often sent from Istanbul to govern over the local peoples, but nobody tried to mess with the language or even the religious traditions of the local population, which meant that the empire was broad but didn't run very deep. There wasn't really any sense that people were had any allegiance to the Ottoman Empire outside of Turkey. Arab populations weren't necessarily conscious of, being ethnically Arab or sharing a language, but they certainly did not feel particularly loyal to their Turkish overlords, as it were. Now, who were the Ottomans? Well, the Ottomans were Turks who came from Central Asia and settled in Anatolia, what is modern-day Turkey, under the rule of the Seljuks, another Turkish empire from the early part of this last millennium. The aristocrats under Osman I formed a confederation and began basically to conquer territory from north central Anatolia. Uh, One of the things that made the Ottomans quite successful was they were known for their tolerance and their fairly mild government towards the inhabitants that they conquered. And initially, they were fairly lenient towards the Christians of Byzantium. Remember that the empire that they had overthrown was basically a Christian empire in Anatolia. And a lot of people thought that this was a big improvement. The Byzantine Empire had been in its last legs for a long, long time, and the emperors of the Byzantine Empire were not known for being particularly good at ruling, and they were known for launching failed wars on the regular, and basically were not highly regarded even by their Christian subjects, and the Ottomans were considered a step up. Sort of regular, predictable taxation, not too much conscription into armies. These were things that ordinary folks were pretty interested in and formed kind of the basis for the success of the Ottomans. And one of the reasons why a lot of the Christians of the Byzantine Empire converted to Islam during this period, because it seemed like this was a far more attractive way of being governed, and of course, as always, it pays to share a religion with the people who are ruling you. Brief history going through, and again, I'm not going to be that interested in the history in your exams, but just to give you some context about where these people are coming from. At first, Murad I turns his eyes west. So the Ottoman Empire first goes west and conquers what we would call the Balkans today, so Greece, Macedonia, Bulgaria, and Serbia. And then his son decides to turn his eyes east, and that was probably a mistake. He runs into the Tartars, who are a semi-nomadic people from Central Asia, led by a fairly famous figure named Tamerlane, and they get defeated there, but the Tartars don't pursue, and so they're able to stabilize their borders. Bayezid's grandson, Muhammad II, is well known for finally taking Constantinople, so finally pushing, for finally getting rid of the Byzantine Empire from the Anatolian Peninsula. Selim the Grim, great name, Muhammad II's grandson, defeats the Persian Safavid Empire in 1514, which becomes significant because after defeating the Shia Empire, he is now recognized by almost all Muslim clerics as caliph, that is to say, leader of the Muslim world, at least the Sunni Muslim world. This happens in 1517. Selim then uses this moral authority that's been conferred upon him to conquer the Hijaz, the part of Saudi Arabia that has Mecca and Medina, the two holiest sites in Islam. To do this, he has to defeat the Mamluk Egyptians, who are currently in control of the area. And what this does is this finally, again, for the first time in several hundred years, unites the historically powerful centers of the Muslim world. So Mecca, Medina, Cairo, Alexandria, Damascus, and Baghdad, these great centers of Islam and the Arab world, are finally back under the same empire after centuries of being fragmented. And this is seen as momentous and significant in the history of the Middle East. So the reasons for ascent, we've already touched upon some of these, but fairly mild treatment of conquered minorities, the establishment of millets. Millets are sort of self-governing communities within the Ottoman Empire where people could practice their local religion as long as they paid an extra tax to the empire. Also, relatively egalitarian treatment of all the peoples that they conquered, and especially those who converted to Islam. There wasn't quite the social stratification that you saw previously under the Arab empires, where the Arabs were fairly were treating themselves as first-class citizens, so to speak. Many people could rise in the Ottoman bureaucracy who were not Turks. So Grand Vizier Ibrahim, for example, was a converted Christian, and many other Christians, Christian converts, but people who started out as Christians were able to rise through the ranks. And so, and this was particularly true in the Janissary Corps. Although, in fairness, the Janissary Corps often abducted its abducted children from Christian communities and then raised them as Muslims for the betterment of the Ottoman Empire. Initially, though, the Janissary Corps was ruthlessly meritocratic, which means that you rose through ability. This, as with many organizations, didn't last for very long, but the Janissary Corps was definitely seen as a vehicle for social advancement, social and economic advancement, and having those avenues and the hopes often keeps people in line when they know that they or their children can aspire to be better than they currently are, or aspire to better their station, I should say. And of course, the Ottoman Empire was well known for avoiding dynastic struggles through a fairly brutal succession system, which was that when the old sultan died, the brother who eventually won the struggle for succession would have all of his brothers and their progeny murdered. And this was the only way that the Ottoman Turks could figure out to prevent instability within the empire. Typically, the Sultan would die, and what would happen is that all his sons would converge upon Istanbul to try to take the crown, and the first one who took the crown and took the control basically gained the support of the important generals and the important pieces of the bureaucracy, would then have everybody else killed. And this is not pretty, but it was certainly effective, and it was certainly more effective than the Abbasid and Umayyad dynastic struggles, which often lasted for a long time and really brought about a whole lot of instability. But the golden age of the Ottoman Empire, the apex, probably 1683, led to a fairly precipitous political decline. In 1774 and 1783, the Ottoman Empire lost two wars with Russia and lost many of its territories around the Black Sea and Ukraine. In 1798, Egypt was invaded by Napoleon, and the Ottomans were defeated several times by Napoleon. In 1808, a coup d'etat was launched by the Janissaries against Sultan Selim III. The coup d'etat was eventually put down, but again, this was a symptom of a lot of the decay going on. And by 1870, the Sultanate was effectively bankrupt and being bankrolled by foreign creditors, propping it up. And by 1881, the Ottoman Public Debt Commission, which was essentially a group of financiers from the West, so from Europe, basically took over the running of the fiscal policy of the empire. So the accounts were basically surrendered to foreigners because essentially the empire was bankrupt. So that's a pretty steep decline. So reasons for the decline, and there are many reasons, and I don't think that there's any simple explanation. But for one, the Ottoman Empire was built up as a military organization and became a very effective military organization. But what it takes to take power and expand your power is not the same as what it takes to keep it, and their economic policies were not seen as being particularly good. The most important the most important problem with their economic policies was their tendency to grant foreign merchants exemptions from taxation. So these were a series of what they called capitulations, which were a series of treaties with various European kingdoms, which granted foreign merchants the right to pass through Ottoman territories unmolested and untaxed. And this meant it was very hard for the Ottoman Empire to raise revenue because they just weren't particularly interested in economics or economic growth. And as a result, a lot of the wealth got taken out by foreign businesses who could compete much better against local businesses because local businesses would have to pay taxes, but foreign merchant houses would not. Let's see. Another issue was with the Janissary Corps that became fairly corrupt and especially rigid. They really refused to adopt many technical innovations, and this is very problematic for the conduct of war. Warfare was changing radically in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, and the Janissaries just weren't interested in keeping up that much. Many of them could not read, and so they did not stay abreast of sort of recent developments in warfare and technology. This was a bit of a problem, as you can imagine, because the empire, at least always had the power of its armies, but this was just about gone by the beginning of the 19th century. And of course, the guardians of power, the Janissaries, ended up coveting power themselves, and so they ended up creating some political instability by trying to overthrow or strong-arm the Sultan. Another issue we could point to is the lack of private property. We know that private property is central to economic development by spurring the incentive for people to work hard and to grow what they have. If you allow if people do not have private property or secure property, they will tend to work only as hard as they can to get what they need, but they won't necessarily work much harder than that because, after all, it's not theirs to keep. So all land being formally owned by the state and everybody essentially being tenants on the land meant that not much improvement, particularly agricultural improvement, was conducted. This just limited the potential for creating large economic surpluses out of which capital investments could eventually be made. And finally, there just wasn't a whole lot of checks and balances going on. The system was highly personalistic, and so when bad decisions were made at the top, they tended to ripple with great speed all the way through the empire. Good emperors could do a lot of good, but bad emperors could destroy. And of course, it's a lot easier to destroy than to create usually. So, this combination of lack of private property and no real aristocracy to balance out the Sultan, the Janissaries, seems to have inhibited the formation of any kind of middle class. You had an elite class and large swaths of citizens who were very, very poor. And finally, as we already mentioned, there was no real attempt to Turkify conquered peoples, particularly Arabs, teach them the Turkish language and the Turkish script. This just did not occur, which meant that, largely speaking, nobody really felt very sorry that the empire was declining. Indeed, many Arabs were looking forward to perhaps newfound independence. So the capitulations treaties, I already mentioned these, but starting in 1453, these gave favorable tax treatment to foreign businesses that wanted to operate in the empire. It also gave some favorable religious treatment to foreign pilgrims who wanted to go to the Holy Lands, particularly around Jerusalem. And these capitulations only ended in 1923 after the Ottoman Empire effectively was abolished. In particular, the Ottoman Empire was a fantastic trade route through India and China, but foreigners didn't get to pay taxes, and local businesses did. So once again, local businesses were at a huge disadvantage economically compared to foreign competitors. This would never happen today, but it's just a symptom of the fact that the sultans just weren't that interested in developing their domestic economy. Um, okay, so another problem, well, this is not really related to the capitulation, was price inflation. I have to say that one of the issues with a declining empire is often that they will try to coin more money, debasing the currency. This was a big problem towards the end of the Ottoman Empire, as they were trying to pay back debts in devalued currency, but this meant that the value of pretty much everybody's currency was down. Um, this is um, this is a common problem in economic history. Okay, so by the 1800s, the need for reform is really widely recognized. In 1839, Mahmud II issues edicts requiring fundamental reforms of government, a real attempt at modernizing this sclerotic state. So the creation of a monetary system, a central bank, banknotes, a stock exchange. Note that the creation of central bank in the Ottoman Empire precedes by almost 70 years the creation of our own Federal Reserve. A new civil and criminal code was created on the model of the French, trying to harmonize really all kinds of disparate rules across the empire. I mean, being a tolerant empire meant that tolerating a whole lot of diversity of rules all over the empire. But what that meant was that the empire wasn't very consistent, and it meant that it was very hard to operate, particularly businesses, across the entire empire when you had to comply with all kinds of strange rules or different rules as you moved from one place to another. It created really a national army, abolished slavery before the United States, it decriminalized homosexuality, it created some public education and universities, as well as creating a hierarchical court system. Until then, the courts had been very decentralized with no, you know, system of appeals and no final court of appeals, except the Sultan, who was the final appeal on everything, and also the abolishment of trade guilds, um, a relic of the Middle Ages. So, fairly progressive reforms, but unfortunately, they sidestepped the biggest problem, which was tax reform. Uh, First of all, most tariffs for most taxes that were collected were not income taxes. Prior to the 20th century, most taxes that were collected were tariffs. Taxes that you have to pay to cross a border or to ship goods across a border. But within an empire with thousands of miles of borders, it's very difficult to and very expensive to collect taxes like that. Moreover, income taxes are very expensive to administer because citizens are poor, and they're not the taxing infrastructure is just not there to track them and track their incomes. Uh, Corporate taxes on foreign companies are banned because of the capitulation, so you can't do that. And so the taxes on existing businesses are just slowing economic development, as existing businesses either can't compete with foreign businesses or simply have a harder time growing because they're taxed. So what happened basically was that eventually the empire could not raise enough taxes to pay for its wars that it was losing anyway. And so, as we said, in 1870, it essentially declared bankruptcy and became administered by its foreign creditors. Uh, these reforms basically, the other reforms that we just talked about, so they avoided the tax reforms, but they tried to reform the system of government. They kind of came to a halt under the Mahmud's successor. Uh, a lot of people were upset, obviously, at the rapid change, and so predictably there was a bit of blowback. The 19th century is just not pretty for the Ottoman Empire. Russia, Britain, and France fight a war with each other, essentially, on Ottoman soil. This is the Crimean War. Uh, the Ottomans were nominally involved in this, but acquitted themselves extraordinarily badly, and they became very aware of how backward they were during this war. Moreover, successful revolts in Bulgaria, Egypt, and Serbia really revealed the weaknesses of the Ottoman government. Abdul Hamid, succeeded Abdul Aziz, tried to restart these reforms, but this was largely seen to be too little and too late. And his big mistake was making an alliance with Kaiser Wilhelm in Germany in 1889, and which led them to be on the wrong side of World War I, and meant that, for all intents and purposes, the empire was dismantled at the Treaty of Lausanne in 1922, which dealt with the Middle East. Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles in 1918 to 1919, dealt with the European side of things, but Lausanne was where the Middle East was dealt with. And we'll talk more about the Treaty of Lausanne as we talk about the Middle East in the 20th century. So, I realized that was fairly long and fairly comprehensive and probably fairly repetitive with respect to the readings, but hopefully this gave you some more information and a new perspective on the matters.